So how are Confederate spies in 1864, President Theodore Roosevelt, the trading post of the Upper Missouri outfit in 1827, and a fellow you've probably never heard of before, Mr. Sherwood Sterling connected? Well, the answer might surprise you. The answer? They all enjoyed smoked buffalo tongue. Actually, I have no idea if that's true or not, but I do know other good stuff, and we're going to find out tonight while together we enjoy Drinking Through History. Well, good evening, fellow history tipplers. I'm your host, Leif Salverson, and tonight, as we are enjoying the episode, if you would wish to enjoy a beverage of your choice, feel free to go ahead and do so. Tonight, myself, I'm going to be enjoying a red ale that's brewed right here in Montana. Go ahead and have something of your choice, but I would encourage you to make sure that you've got something to be able to cleanse your palate. A little bit later on, perhaps some water as well, too, when we get into the segment in which we're going to be building our beverage tonight, that your taste buds will be prepped for being able to enjoy that. So to begin to answer our question that will eventually lead us to tonight's drink, we obviously need to look to the past.
Picture it. Sicily, 1912.
Well, actually, for us, it's going to be New York City, and while 1912 doesn't play a specific role in tonight's story, 1913 does, but we'll get that eventually. We need to start out by going back to the year 1836. Now, we're going to be in New York City in 1836, and there's a fellow there who previously to this had a home in New York City that he didn't live in anymore, and as time went on, he began to purchase all of the lots around where his home was, to the point that in 1836, the man builds a hotel. All right. And this is not some, ordinary hotel. This hotel encompasses the entire city block, all the way around, four sides. He builds this hotel. And it's not just any hotel. It ends up being the best hotel in New York City at this particular time. It had some interesting things that helped make it special. It originally opened as Park Hotel, and possibly it was because it was built across the street from the New York City Hall Park, though history remembers the hotel's name by a slightly different name. So Park Hotel was pretty uptown, both figuratively and literally. It had some really unique stuff to it that made it the special place that it was in New York City. For example, it was constructed of bluish quincy granite by a Bostonian architect named Isaiah Rogers in kind of a Greek revival style. In the front, there were two large columns by the front entrance, and this hotel was 6 stories tall and had 309 rooms, which enabled it to provide lodging for 800 people. Now, 120 of those are the people that are actually working at the hotel. It had some amazing amenities for its time, which included new gas lights, bathtubs, and toilets on each floor. Now remember, this is 1836. This hotel has plumbing that works. Now, pressurized water in New York City isn't even available in this area yet for an additional 6 years. In 1842, they'll finally finish the Croton aqueduct system that'll make those things possible. So how does this hotel, this grand place in New York City, where there is no pressurized water, manage to pull these different things off? Well, in the basement of the hotel, they had 2 large cisterns, and from that, the hotel had its own steam engine plant that would draw from those cisterns and pressurize and run the entire system. It's kind of a marvel, really. Oh, and in that basement, they also had a printing press so they could print their daily menus. Kind of posh, huh? Now, originally, the hotel had an open, tree-shaded courtyard in the center that's surrounded by the 4 sides of the hotel. And you could imagine it'd probably be a place where patrons there would go to enjoy some sheltered, somewhat peace and quiet, shielded from the rest of the city while they're visiting there. Now, that's going to change, though. In 1852, cast iron and glass rotunda, which was designed by a fellow by the name of James Bogardus, he builds this and covers the courtyard, and now we see what is initially called the Rotunda Saloon. Later becomes known as the insert hotel's name here, Exchange. And a lot of people would enjoy a drink and a meal there at the Exchange. Over the course of the hotel's life, a number of noteworthy people would end up frequenting the Park Hotel. For example, for many years, actually, it ended up being the headquarters for the Whig Party. A notable Whig Party senator, Mr. Daniel Webster, would end up telling the Times that he would stay at no other hotel. Now, another name that you've probably heard of before, who stayed there in the 1840s, who we now today know as one of the famous Civil War photographers, Mr. Matthew Brady. He lived at the hotel there for that span of time. He's the one who gives us these wonderful, well, gruesome at times as well too, but some of the best and amazing images that we have for studying the American Civil War. Many of us, myself included, have been able to study these images from the Library of Congress because of the ambrotype images that he was taking. As long as that camera's in focus, you kind of have, to an extent, this infinite amount of detail that you can really zoom in on. So his photographs provide a lot of information to us. So he was living there at the hotel in 1840. In fact, his studio, the one that he had at the time, wasn't terribly far away from it. Now, in 1843, another name that you've probably heard of before, recently then married Henry Longfellow and his wife Frances, or Fanny, would end up staying there. And another person that maybe you've heard of before, a younger inventor, enjoyed frequenting it there on the weekends, whose name was, well, Thomas Edison as well. Notable events would end up taking place at the hotel as well. We think of ringing in the new year. And on the TVs, whether you watch it or not, we know that in New York City we celebrate by doing a countdown and the ball drops. Well, before that ball took place there, as they're starting to celebrate New Year's in this way, doing the countdown, that actually was taking place on the street right outside of the Park Hotel. In 1861, then President-elect Lincoln would stay there, and standing on the top of the entrance portico, gave an impromptu speech to a crowd of 40,000 people, according to Walt Whitman, at least. And while we're speaking of presidents, no fewer than 18 of them, from Andrew Jackson to President Theodore Roosevelt, would end up staying there in the hotel. Now, obviously, not all occurrences that take place at a location are always good, but are still memorable at the same time. For example, in November 25th of 1864, after the re-election of President Lincoln, Confederate spies set the Park Hotel along with 13 other major hotels in New York City on fire. Fortunately, though, it wasn't damaged that much, and life went on after that. Also of note was during the Great Blizzard of 1888 and another blizzard later on in the early 1900s, it ended up being a safe haven for people who were in the area. Now, regardless of how grand and wonderful this historic hotel was, it becomes inevitable the looming march of time and, well, progress would eventually claim the hotel as its own. By the 1870s, it was considered an old-fashioned place, and the chief patronage there at the time were mostly businessmen. A newer hotel in the area, now we remember the modern conveniences that Park Hotel had. A newer hotel that went up actually had an amazing innovation. It had central heating. So despite those advances that it had initially, we see the rest of the world's beginning to catch up with it now. So it's kind of starting to seem like this old-fashioned place in the 1870s and the 1880s. And then finally, we fast forward to the year 1913. We see the beginning of the end for the hotel, unfortunately. The southern half, which included the famous Rotunda Saloon, or the insert hotel name here, Exchange, has to be torn down. And the reason why they have to demolish it is to the building of the BMT subway line that ends up going right through the site. The northern half would hold out for a while longer, until 1926. It too would be demolished so that what was then called the Transportation Building, today the 225 Broadway, could be constructed. Now, even though this hotel, as we said, was originally called Park Hotel, was considered out of vogue in the later decades of the 1800s, it was still considered a pretty important fixture of New York City. In fact, in 1889, which happens to be the years that the great states of Montana and our neighbors North Dakota become states in the Union, a guy by the name of J.A. Mitchell would write a short fantasy story set far off in the future, the year 2951 to be exact, that actually features the ruins of New York City and the ruins of the hotel, where we finally have revealed to us what the name history mostly knows the hotel as. Now, what ends up happening is that there are these Persian explorers, and they are exploring the ruins of New York City and the hotel, and they come across what they called the Wooden God, and that Wooden God actually was a wooden cigar store Indian statue. But they also come across an upturned slab, upon which was inscribed Astor House. So One of the characters says to the other, "The inscription is in Old English. House signified..." I'm just now realizing that for whatever dopey reason, I thought Parisian explorers in that time frame has ye old timey Western character voice. And you know what? Screw it. No, they do. In 2951, that's exactly what those Parisian explorers sound like. Fight me on this. "The inscription is Old English. House signified a dwelling. But the word Astor I know not. It was probably the name of a deity, and here was his temple." Well, okay, J.A. Mitchell's not alive, so I don't think he'll be upset. But you don't know. You don't know that that's not what he had in mind. So we finally have the name that history remembers the hotel for most, the Astor House. The Astor House. Mr. John Jacob Astor himself is the owner of this hotel. He's the same guy that creates the American Fur Company, who in 1827 would buy out the Columbia Fur Company and keeps on a little guy by the name of Mr. Kenneth Mackenzie, the king of the Upper Missouri himself, renames it the Upper Missouri Outfit of the American Fur Company. And so that's how it's all connected, including the last person that we haven't talked about yet, Mr. Sherwood or Shed Sterling, and he's the one we're going to be using to bringing us to tonight's drink. Now, in the earlier decades of the 1800s, staff and libations, for that matter, functioned differently in the hotels during that time. Now, your desk clerks, these are going to be the guys that are checking you in, obviously. They have your mail, they tell people where to go places, they know where people have gone and all of that, but they're also your barkeeper, okay? It was all the same job. So at that time, bars in these hotels were kept in the lobby in this caged off type of area, so that when the clerk was off duty, you could close the cage up and you can lock it, because it's not cool when the patrons run off with all the unguarded booze. Now, for quite some time, alcoholic punches were the mainstays at a lot of these earlier 1800 hotels. That was going to be the mainstay for quite a while. However, unlike England, in the United States here, these clerk barkeepers are beginning to futz with things and learn from things that they'd heard about or that they had drunk themselves. They were kind of becoming our early mixologists, at least as far as mixed drinks and cocktails went. That's partially how these new drinks would spread from place to place. For example, a hotel clerk bartender ends up going someplace else, gets introduced to the Mint Julep, comes back to their hotel and starts making the same thing. So you can see how it kind of shifts after a while. The Mint Julep, and yeah, it's actually that old, these are one of the notable early-ish cocktails where they're starting to use ice. And this is all quite likely how things initially were taking place at the Astor House. The bar was likely in a cage in the lobby until the Rotunda Saloon, later called the Astor House Exchange, was built in 1852. Now, the Astor House Exchange had a large central mahogany bar. It had private dining rooms on the sides and two long curved counters where you could grab lunch if you wanted to. And this would be a favored meeting place for New York's movers and shakers for decades. This was a hop-in place that a lot of people frequented. Now, as for Shed Sterling, whom we haven't talked about much at all, he was one of these such barkeepers who worked at the Astor House Hotel. And unfortunately, we don't know much about him, but we do know that he was at least a prominent enough guy that the annals of history actually took note of him. And we have evidence that the guy actually existed and was one of these clerk barkeeps there at the Astor House Hotel. Now, just like so many other things in life, as time moves on, these early mixed drinks start to become fancier and fancier. And by the time we get to the 1870s, 1880s, a number of the patrons begin requesting the old-fashioned and simpler cocktails that they were used to from decades past.
Can I get an old-fashioned?
No, not that old-fashioned. But this one that we're learning about tonight likely is the grandfather, the starting place that eventually became that old-fashioned cocktail. If you're staying at the Astor House Hotel, this is likely a beverage that you could have asked Shed himself to actually make for you. So let's cleanse those palates, get our mixology gear in front of us, and in the memory of guys like Shed Sterling and the Astor House Hotel, let's build ourselves a drink. Thanks to David Wondrich in his wonderful book, Imbibe, he's preserved for us what he calls the original cocktail. This comes from J.E. Alexander's Transatlantic Sketches in 1833, which reads as thus. For the receipt book, let the following be copied. Cocktail is composed of water, with the addition of rum, gin, or brandy, as one chooses. A third of the spirit to 2/3 of the water. Add bitters, and enrich with sugar and nutmeg. I'm not recalling off the top of my head what NB stands for. If there is no nutmeg convenient, a scrape or two of the muddler, wooden sugar breaker, will answer the purpose. Now, at this particular time of rum, gin, and brandy, Holland gin and brandy were the two most popular. But obviously you can use any of those because that's what's listed in this account from 1833.
All right, so we have all of our components together. We've got our water, we've got our glass, your spirit of choice. I tonight am using gin. Now, this really should not be a London dry gin, but Beefeater is a good choice as far as London dry gins go. A Dutch or Holland style gin would be the proper choice for tonight. But again, as we're doing this, we're having the opportunity to enjoy what's actually, going on where we didn't necessarily before. Of course, we've got our copy of David Wondrich with us, Imbibe, and we're going to be using some of the suggested ratios that David Wondrich has as kind of our base model of this drink. And as time goes on, if you make the cocktail again, tweak it a little bit more, and I'll explain some of those different things. So we've got our water, we've got our spirit, which in my case tonight is gin. We've got our glass, I've got my nutmeg, and I've got a microplane that I'm going to be using. Of course, you can always use the historic pierced kind as well. I've got my Angostura bitters. You don't have to have a fancy dasher like what I do. Coming straight out of the bottle is fine. I've got my sugar cubes that I'm going to be using. If you're not using sugar cubes, Mr. Wondrich suggests using a 1/2 ounce, I believe, of sugar. I've got my bar spoon, but you don't necessarily need a bar spoon. Any old spoon will do. And then for measuring, I've got my fancy cocktail jigger. But even if you've got something that's more like this, that's got these different gradations, as you can see, by 1/2 ounces. And down there at the bottom, you can figure out where 1/4 ounces as well. That'll do the job. So let's start building this thing. I'm going to start by taking my glass. And then what I'm going to do, since I'm using sugar cubes, and really these should be Demerara sugar cubes, and I feel like such a farb right now. I've got them ordered, they just didn't come in. I am going to start by soaking one of the sugar cubes. Now, Mr. Wondrich suggests that you do, I think it's 4 or 5 dashes if you're using the granulated sugar. So we're going to start there, and we're going to put this down the bottom. And at this point, if you had a muddler, you can go ahead and muddle that up. I'm going to take my bar spoon and I'm going to break that up some. So it's starting to be broken up for us. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with 2 ounces is what he suggests of your spirit. So that's what we're going to do. The set of my jigger is 2 ounces. Just right on into the glass. And then we're going to use 3 ounces of water to start. Now, back in the day when the cocktail was being made, the spirits were higher proof than what they are now. So that's why we start with 3 ounces. Depending on what your proof is, mine's just 40 proof. So it's not an overproof one at all. You can actually pull back, but I'm going to suggest starting here as you are enjoying this beverage to begin with. So we've got our 2 ounces of spirit, we've got our 3 ounces of water, we've got our Angostura bitters soaked, sugar cube in there. And right now, I'm just going to stir it up some just to help get that dissolved. A muddler does make that job a lot easier, but I wanted us to be able to see how we can do it without a bunch necessarily different pieces of gear. And then to taste, whether you are using granulated or whole nutmeg, go ahead and grate some in or sprinkle some in. I've made this a couple times before, so I've got a pretty good idea of the amount of nutmeg I want in mine. And that's going to be pretty good. I'm going to give her another stir. And there we have the cocktail from 1833 from those transatlantic sketches. So just one more time, the ratios that we have there, we are using 2 ounces of spirit, 3 ounces of water, 4 or 5 dashes of bitters. If you're using a sugar cube, just go ahead and soak it. And then if you're not using a sugar cube, it's a ½ ounce of sugar. Grate nutmeg on top. Please do not grate your muddler. That's a terrible idea.
So here it is. The original cocktail from 1833, similar to what we could have had Shed Sterling build for us ourselves. Let's give it a try. I can smell a combination of the juniper and the nutmeg that we've got grated in here. Obviously yours is going to be different if you didn't use gin. And if you've got Holland's gin, you lucky dog you. I wish that I could enjoy it that way right now. So those 3 ounces of water has muted down the London Dry Gin that I've got in here. It's not bad at all. It's rather smooth as a result of that. The sugar helps it out a little bit. You can taste the Angostura in there as well too. It's fairly well balanced of all those flavors. Nothing's really overpowering, well, depending on how much nutmeg you decide to put in your beverage anyway. This is a very approachable drink that a lot of people could enjoy. So if you are a living historian like I am myself, and you're at a historic event, and you want to enjoy a historic beverage while they're out there, the cocktail, the original cocktail from this example from 1833, this would be a wonderful one to try and make. So again, there it is, the cocktail from 1833, similar to what we could have asked Shed to make for us, to build together for us if we were staying at the Astor House. Say, if you managed to tolerate this program and enjoy stuff like this, as well as other lesser-known history, I'd highly encourage you to check out my good buddy Brandon Delvo's podcast called The Past Less Traveled. You can find it on Anchor. You can listen to it on Spotify. He's got a Facebook page for it as well. I'll put a link down in the bottom at the end of the video here. Now, he's got no idea that I'm doing this at all. He's a fellow living historian. He's a good guy, and it's good stuff, so you should really check it out. So thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you were able to enjoy the program. I'm hoping that you were able to enjoy it with some friends, perhaps some fellow historic tipplers, or not. And I would encourage you to do so in the future if you can. The reason being is, well, it's just better when we history together. Again, I'm Leif Halverson, and I look forward to the next time we can enjoy Drinking Through History.